Morning, folks. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Jeremy Corbyn will be challenged for the Labour Party leadership by his former Shadow Cabinet colleague, Angela Eagle. So what makes her so sure she can win? Miss Eagle joins me live. She's the favoured candidate of Tory MPs, but will Theresa May win over the party's grassroots to become the next Prime Minister? And if she makes it to number 10, what will her premiership be like? We'll hear from May supporter Chris Grayling. And after 2 tumultuous weeks following the referendum result, the leading Remain campaign insider gives us her candid account of what went wrong.
And here in the capital, a report suggests poverty is worse in outer London than inner. Have the suburbs been sacrificed as inner London enjoys a gold rush?
So all that plus Tim Farron before 12:15. And with me, Janan Ganesh, Helen Lewis and Isabel Oakeshott to help guide us through the political maelstrom. They'll be tweeting throughout the programme using the hashtag BBCSP. Now, the battle to take over from David Cameron as Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister has rapidly moved into its final phase. A vote of Conservative Party members who must choose between the Home Secretary and Remain supporter Theresa May and the Business Minister and Leave campaigner Andrea Leadsom. Speaking of the launch of her campaign, Theresa May said she wanted to unite the Tory party and the country.
If ever there was a time for a Prime Minister who is ready and able to do the job from day one, this is it. We have immediate work to do to restore political stability and economic certainty, to bring together the party and the country, and to negotiate a sensible and orderly departure from the European Union. But more than that, we have a mission to make Britain a country that works not for the privileged and not for the few, but for every one of our citizens.
And we're now joined by Leader of the Commons, Chris Grayling, one of 4 cabinet ministers to campaign to leave the EU, but he's now supporting Theresa May, who campaigned for Remain. So why is a Leaver like you supporting a Remainer like Mrs May?
Well, the key thing is now having the right person for the job. David Cameron's chosen to step aside. I regret that. We now need somebody who's got the experience to step into his shoes and somebody in whom I and we can have confidence that they will deliver Brexit. Now, I've known Theresa for a very long time. She's a very determined politician. I know that having got a mandate from the public to deliver Brexit, that she'll do that. I wouldn't be supporting her if that wasn't the case.
What assurances have you sought from her?
Well, I've sought absolute assurances from her that she means what she says. When she says Brexit means Brexit. It is really important. The country has spoken. The country has given us a clear direction to follow. The next Prime Minister has to follow that direction. I'm 100% confident that Theresa understands that and is committed to it.
But as we learned during the referendum, Brexit can mean one of several things. There are varieties of Brexit. So what do you say to Tory leavers who were on your side, that they're worried she'll water down the Brexit terms?
Well, I don't think that's right at all. And again, of course, it's not just me. We have a whole range of Tory leavers who are backing her, David Davis, Liam Fox, Priti Patel, because we think that she has got the weight and the experience to deliver what people want.
You've said that, but I'm still not quite sure of what assurances you've got that she will deliver as you would want her to, and David Davis and others. For example, can you guarantee to our viewers this morning that she won't settle for a British version of Norway's relationship with the EU or Switzerland's relationship with the EU?
Well, what we've said all along and what Theresa has said to me is we want a UK solution. We want a UK relationship with the European Union. It's not about trying to replicate someone else's. We've got a clear mandate, for example, to end the principle of unfettered free movement into the United Kingdom from elsewhere in the European Union. We saw nearly 200,000 people net arrive in the United Kingdom last year. The British public have given us a clear mandate that they want that to change.
Well, Theresa May has promised, quote, control of free movement. That needn't be the same as the end of free movement, is it? What does she mean by control?
But that's what we campaigned on for 4.5 months, taking back control. The thing that I found unacceptable and still find unacceptable is that we cannot control the flow of people into the country. Now, there will be times when we need to recruit particular skills, where we need to allow people to move within businesses. We need to have a managed system. So it's all about control. It's about our politicians, our government, being able to decide when, how and where, and the number of people who can come and live and work in the United Kingdom. And that's what we campaign for.
But for some EU citizens, would there still be an automatic right to come here?
Well, it will depend on what our rules set out by our Parliament are. The whole point about this, it is about control. At the moment, we have no control. We cannot set limits on the number of people who come and live and work here. And the very clear mandate from the British public, something that Theresa absolutely 100% recognised and said so in her opening speech as a campaign launched last week, we have to take back control of our migration system.
But we don't know what control means.
Well, it means our Parliament, our government, being able to set limits on the number of people who can come and live and work here.
What sort of limits then?
Well, that's going to be decided depending on whether we have skills needs, whether we have housing shortages, depending on the circumstances. None of us envisage a situation where we erect barricades at Dover and nobody can ever come and live and work or move within companies into the United Kingdom. But it's absolutely fundamental that the ultimate control over what happens should reside with our government and our Parliament.
Why do you trust Mrs May on free movement when after 6 years at the Home Office, she couldn't even get non-EU net migration below 100,000? Which was the promise. Never mind overall net migration. Why would you trust her?
Well, I mean, first of all, do bear in mind we spent 5 of those 6 years in coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
But she's not claimed she was stopped from doing anything.
But we have just passed our first Conservative-only Immigration Act that will, for example, allow us to close the bank accounts and take away the driving licences of people who overstay. One of the challenges in the immigration system is people who come here legitimately for a short period but never go. That's something we need to address.
But why would you trust her? She's so far out. Net migration 3 times the target that she agreed to 6 years ago. Why would you trust her to get it right when so far she's got it horrendously wrong?
Well, if you look at the flow of migrants from inside the European Union, she's got no ability to control that at all.
But she's not even controlled the ones from outside. That's my point.
Yeah. And what I've said, Andrew, is we have just passed our first Conservative-only Immigration Act. There have been limits to what we can do over the last few years in coalition. We've introduced a whole raft of different measures. But, of course, as Theresa May herself said the other day, it is very difficult because people are constantly looking for new ways around our system. I hope and believe the Act that we passed 2 months ago, the first Conservative-only Immigration Act, will make a significant difference.
In what way are our borders safer under Mrs May than they were in 2010?
Well, our borders are safe in terms of counter-terrorism.
No, safer.
Because,
in what ways are they safer? What's she done to make us safer?
well, a huge amount of work has been put in place to protect our borders. If you look at what's been done in Calais, we have now got a much better system of border control in Calais. We've been able to resist enormous pressure from people who want to come into the country illegally.
What has she done to make the British borders safer?
Well, she has introduced a whole raft of new measures on the immigration front.
You said that.
She has strengthened the border at Calais. She's negotiated international agreements that, for example, saw Abu Qatada deported to Jordan. She has, in my view, done a huge amount to improve the workings of our security services. As Home Secretary, she's responsible for the workings of MI5. They've done a fantastic job in protecting us against security threats in the last 5 years.
Will she rule out a second referendum?
Oh, there's no question of a second referendum.
Well, don't you say that, but Dominic Grieve, who's one of our prominent supporters and her team, says the referendum result's not written in stone, people can change their minds.
No. Theresa's been very clear, we're all very clear, there is not going to be a second referendum. We can't just turn around and say to the British public, we didn't like what you said the first time round, so we're going to ask you again. Actually, those of us who campaign passionately for leave would not serve in a government that simply chucked away the first result and decided we'll have another go. I wouldn't serve in that situation. I wouldn't back Theresa if I thought that was the case for a moment.
All right, that's clear enough. Speaking of the campaign, do you regard the promises Vote Leave made during the referendum as sacrosanct? Promises you made?
One of the things I said to you on this programme during the course of the campaign, Andrew, was that a campaign group can only make recommendations. Right. It's for government to implement.
But you made a number of promises. For example, you promised explicitly that the status of EU citizens already here would not change. Mrs May's not promising that.
Well, I cannot conceive of a situation where we would want to end the rights of EU citizens who are here to not remain. I mean, of course, there's always some individual circumstances, those committing criminal offences, for example.
But she's talking about them being a bargaining chip.
No,
she has not said. You said during the campaign there will be no change for EU citizens already lawfully resident in the UK. Mrs May is not saying that.
Well, of course, legally, for those who've been here for more than 5 years, that is legally the case today. But, of course, we want to make sure that we can protect our own citizens in other EU countries. It's right and proper that a UK government should have its own UK citizens.
But you never said that. During the campaign, you never said there'll be no change to EU citizens here, provided the EU looks after our citizens there. That was never a condition. Now, are you saying it is?
I don't think there will be any change on either side. I think everyone will take a grown-up approach to this. It would be too damaging to do otherwise. However, we should always make sure that we look after the interests of our own citizens. I don't think anything is going to change. I don't expect for a moment.
So why doesn't she say that?
What she said last week.
No. She says that she doesn't want to agree anything till she sees how they treat our citizens. Are you comfortable with the line that she's taken? The only people who support her on this are the BNP.
She has said precisely what I've just said. I'm expecting all EU citizens, perhaps bar those who committed criminal offences and one or two other individual circumstances, to be able to stay as they do now, and I'm expecting UK citizens in other countries to be able to stay there too. That's right and proper, but of course we should make sure that we can look after the interests of United Kingdom citizens if we need to.
Can you guarantee, can Mrs May, has she guaranteed to you that we'll be out of the EU by the next general election?
Well, the timing, of course, requires that. She said that we will trigger Article 50 around the end of this year. There is then a 2-year time frame. The next general election is 2020. So I can't see any circumstances in which we wouldn't leave by 2020.
So the answer is yes, gone by 2020.
That's what I would expect. I said that during the campaign. In timing terms, that's where we would end up, yes.
Chris Grayling, thank you. After a protracted campaign of resignations, a massive vote of no confidence from his MPs and an attempt by his deputy to negotiate some sort of compromise here with the unions, it's now clear that Jeremy Corbyn will face a leadership challenge. Some suspected it might fizzle out, but Angela Eagle has finally announced she will go for the top job after all, saying she wants to explain my vision for the country. It comes after Labour's deputy leader, Tom Watson, called off talks with union leaders over Jeremy Corbyn's future, complaining that there was no realistic prospect of reaching a compromise because of Mr Corbyn's refusal to stand down. That provoked an angry response from Unite leader Len McCluskey, who said Tom Watson's actions today can only look like an act of sabotage, fraught with peril for the future of the Labour Party. So what happens now? Angela Eagle needs to get the backing of 20% of MPs and MEPs. The magic number is currently 51. There's also the prospect of another senior Labour figure like Owen Smith throwing his hat into the ring. The big question remains over whether Jeremy Corbyn automatically gets onto the ballot or whether he needs to get the 51 nominations himself. A difficult task, given the Labour leader lost the vote of no confidence among his MPs by 172 votes to 40. However, if he does get on the ballot paper, it's Angela Eagle who has the difficult job. Over 250,000 people voted for Mr Corbyn in the last Labour leadership election, nearly 60% of the vote. Since the EU referendum, nearly 130,000 people have joined the Labour Party, though it's unclear how many of them want to help or hinder Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Now, Jeremy Corbyn appeared on the Andrew Marr programme a little earlier today on BBC One. He was clearly in no mood to throw in the towel.
Why should I time limit a leadership when I've been elected by a very large number of members and supporters in order to lead this party? If, at the end of the day, an election somewhere results in a different leader, so be it. But I would be irresponsible if I walked away from a mandate that I was given and a responsibility I was given. I ask colleagues to respect that as well.
And Angela Eagle joins me now. Good morning. Welcome back on the programme. Why are you challenging Jeremy Corbyn for the Labour leadership?
Well, I think it's clear that he's lost the confidence of MPs in the parliamentary party. Tom Watson, our deputy leader, who has his own mandate, Rosie Winterton, the chief whip, John Cryer, who's the chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party and a friend of Jeremy's, have been going to try to say to him that he needs the confidence of the Parliamentary Party to continue. He's not listening. You can't lead behind an office door.
But maybe he's not listening because he has a huge mandate from the party membership. As Labour leader, he's won every by-election. He's won the London mayoral election, 3 other mayoral elections, the largest party in the local government elections. Why wouldn't you want to carry on?
But we lost seats in the local government elections. When we have a Conservative government, we should be doing much better. Polling shows that we're 7% behind the Conservatives, even after all the tumult they've been through, and more importantly, we lost the EU referendum.
But that wasn't entirely, or even maybe largely his fault.
I'm not saying it was entirely Jeremy's fault, but he wasn't connecting with Labour voters and he didn't put the argument across. So I think we need a strengthened Labour Party and an opposition that can unite so we can heal the country, and unfortunately I just don't think Jeremy can do that job.
Other than Trident, what are the major policy differences?
Well, I think I'm on the left. Any party that I lead will be an anti-austerity party, because what's happened in our heartlands is that they have been hit by 6 years of Conservative cuts piled onto them, much more.
I understand, that's Mr Corbyn's position too. I asked you what are the major policy differences?
Well, I think that I want to lead a strong, united opposition to get into government. Now, Jeremy was asked 3 times in that interview this morning whether he thought he could win a general election. Right. He didn't say yes.
I understand.
For our supporters,
I understand that you think he's a loser.
For the people we came into politics to represent, we need a Labour Party that can position itself as a strong, united opposition and win a general election.
But that's, in your view, having a leader that's a winner. I'll ask again, what are the major policy differences?
I don't think that Jeremy has managed to get across a strategy for winning. I'm on the left. My politics came out of what happened when I was growing up, when my parents, my mum a seamstress, my dad a printer, were prevented from fulfilling their opportunities. Because we had Labour governments, I was able to fulfil mine. I want a Labour Party that can deliver that. Jeremy doesn't talk about that.
I was just trying to find out what the differences are, but let me move on. He's the incumbent leader. Should he not surely be on the ballot against you as of right?
Well, the Labour Party rules and precedent is that if there's a challenge, there has to be 51 nominations for the incumbent. Jeremy should know this because Tony Benn challenged the then incumbent Neil Kinnock in 1988. Jeremy was the campaign manager and Neil had to get 51 nominations. But really that's a matter for the National Executive Committee to decide.
Well, it's not clear that he had to do it. And even Mr Kinnock can't remember if he had to do it or whether he did it to show the strength. But put aside the rules, don't you think most people watching this programme, not just Corbynistas, not even just Labour members, would find it strange that the man who won the leadership fairly and decisively, now challenged by you, is not automatically allowed to defend his title?
But that is not clear from the Labour Party rules, and the National Executive Committee will make a decision on that. But let me just say, anyone who aspires to lead the parliamentary party who can't get 51 members, 20% of the parliamentary party to back them, is not going to be able to do the job properly. And we are in challenging times. The Brexit vote, we've had a government that's gone missing in action. We need a strong lead from the Labour Party if we're going to protect our communities who are going to be the hardest hit. Nothing of that lead is coming from Jeremy at the moment.
But you are also the self-styled party of fairness. And don't you think that it will offend against natural justice, against most people's idea of fairness, if the incumbent who is challenged by you is not allowed to fight you in an election? Won't that just seem incredible? Forget the rules, forget the NEC. Just offends against fairness.
Well, look, I don't know what the outcome of the NEC's
does it not offend against your idea of fairness?
Will be. I am ready to fight a leadership challenge and have debates about the future of our party with anyone, be it Jeremy or anyone else who seeks to stand.
Len McCluskey of Unite, perhaps the most important person in the Labour Party today.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, I said perhaps.
I wouldn't say that.
Others
I think
may
that's
not. I just said
a
perhaps.
big perhaps, and I have a lot of respect for Len.
Well, he says that keeping Mr Corbyn off the ballot would cause, quote, lasting division in the party. And he's right, it would, wouldn't it?
This isn't about the Labour Party being split or divided. It's about it being an effective and united opposition to make our democracy work so that we can challenge this Conservative government, which has done such damage with the Brexit vote. Sure. And I want to say that if you think that we should have a strong and effective Labour Party, a strong democracy, and challenge the Conservatives, join the Labour Party now. Do it today. You can do it online.
Almost 130,000 new members have joined Labour since the referendum. Do you have any idea who they are?
Well, I'm sure the Labour Party nationally knows who they are.
Have they been vetted?
I want more people
but have
to
they
join
been
the
vetted?
Labour Party. I have no idea what the Labour Party office are doing about the new members, but I think it's important that people who think that we need a strong opposition join this battle now, join the Labour Party, make us stronger, participate in the debate to come.
Which means the 130,000 who've already joined since the referendum, they should be allowed to vote.
Well, again, that's a matter for the National Executive Committee to
there's
decide.
No point people
there's no point
people joining now that you're calling them to do if they're not going to be allowed to vote.
They were allowed to vote in the past. We haven't even opened up the £3 membership, which was such a feature of the last campaign. And let's bear this in mind, Andrew. 150,000 people are going to be picking the next Conservative Prime Minister. We've had nearly that number join in the last week.
Yeah, Mr Corbyn would say he won by, what was it, over 235,000 voted for him. But do you expect to be the only challenger to Mr Corbyn?
I have no idea.
Well, have you spoken to Owen Smith? Might he run?
We have spoken, but not recently. I have no idea. I'm concentrating on launching my campaign, which I'll be doing tomorrow.
But from your point of view, it would be absurd for you and Owen Smith or someone else from the middle of the party or the moderate left to split the anti-Corbyn vote. That would be suicide.
Well, what we have to do is get on with doing our own planning and see what happens in the future. I'm concentrated on getting my campaign up and running, on launching it tomorrow and joining a battle to have a strong and united Labour Party that can give hope back to our country.
You voted for the Iraq war.
Yeah.
Do you regret that now?
I do regret it, and certainly if I'd have known then what I know now, I wouldn't have supported it. I think the important thing from the Chilcot report is that we learn the lessons of that so those mistakes can never be made again in the future.
Would you go as far as John Prescott this morning, who also voted for it, to say that he now regards the war as illegal?
Well, Chilcot hasn't said that.
No,
I think it's important. I think it's important that we learn the lessons.
Right, but do you think it was illegal?
The evidence at the time and the Attorney General's advice at the time wasn't to that effect, and it's no good trying to second guess what's happened subsequently. Okay. We need to learn the lessons, and we need to ensure that if anything like that happens in the future, we have more robust ways of testing these assertions. But you know, I also think that we've got a country divided at the moment.
No, you've said
very uncertain about the future.
You have said that.
We have to make certain that we address those problems as well.
I understand that, but forgive me because we haven't got too much time for just moving on. There's going to be a motion before Parliament, likely next week, holding Tony Blair for contempt of Parliament because of Iraq. How will you vote?
Well, I haven't seen the motion yet. We have to make certain that we don't spend our time in Parliament just exacting revenge. I think Tony Blair has been put rightly through the mill about the decisions he took. The Chilcot report did that, and I think we should.
He suffered enough.
We would be far better learning the lessons and making certain that we don't fall into the same mistakes if, God forbid, there should be a future occasion where these decisions are made.
Final question. Because you talk about uniting Labour in order to be able to unite the country and take on the Tories. But if you lose and Mr Corbyn wins, or even if you win and Mr Corbyn lose, isn't there clear indications that your party could be heading for a serious schism? Either way.
No, I think we need to heal the party under effective leadership so we can have a chance of winning that general election, which may come much sooner than we all think. And that is my main aim with launching this leadership bid at this time.
If he wins, will you accept the result?
Well, you have to accept the result of any...
Would you then go back into the shadow cabinet
You have
if
to
asked?
accept the result of any...
Would you go back into the shadow cabinet?
You have to accept the result of any democratic process, but I am focused on winning this, and I'm not going to speculate about what happens afterwards.
All right, Angela Eagle, busy summer ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, it's clear the battle inside Labour is about to get nasty. This morning, the MP who initiated the vote of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn, Margaret Hodge, had this to say about the Labour leader.
I used to think he was a decent man. I'm beginning to think he's actually a devious man who is more concerned with destroying the Labour Party than he is with creating a force that can win an election in such difficult times and which will unite the party.
So there we are. We've heard from Chris Grayling, we've heard from Angela Eagle, we've heard from Mr Corbyn this morning as well. Helen, whatever the outcome, but however way you cut it, it looks like this ends badly for Labour.
I think it's really interesting. We did an issue in the New Statesman in January saying, should Labour split? And the overall consensus was no, under first past the post, a new party gets destroyed in the way the SDP did. But I'm now talking to Labour MPs who are openly talking about it, people who would not, who are tribally Labour, who are not kind of metropolitan and could easily have ended up in any one party. People who are tribally Labour are saying, this cannot be sewn back together. I think the big question is whether or not, if Jeremy Corbyn gets on the ballot, if he gets those 50 MPs, I think he will win. If he doesn't get on, I think then that becomes a case of his faction splitting off. So the battle really is everyone is sort of imagining a split might happen. It's who gets who gets left with custody of the
Control
party.
of the Labour brand, which is a powerful brand.
And who splits off. But the big thing is, the union funding is already on a downward slope anyway because of the way that's going. The trade union bill is going to reduce that further. And Labour has had very little success with its big donors under Jeremy Corbyn.
There's a kind of fundamental force at work here. The party's grassroots wants a different parliamentary Labour Party, and the parliamentary Labour Party wants a different grassroots. I mean, one or other has to go their own way. You cannot reconcile the two.
No, you can't. And the entire texture of those grassroots has changed over the past year since the party was opened up by Ed Miliband to new members. But it might be changing in the other direction even as we speak. 130,000 new members apparently since June, equivalent roughly to the size of the Tory party. It's possible that the bulk of those people are people who maybe since the referendum campaign want a party that's moderate.
But we
roughly.
don't know that, do we?
We don't know that. And Angela Eagle is ultimately taking a punt on the idea that those are relatively centrist voters. What I detect from both her and Owen Smith, another mooted candidate from the moderate end, is not a massive amount of enthusiasm for running for this leadership. They don't radiate glee at the prospect of becoming leader. So I wonder whether the idea is have an interim leader who's relatively moderate and then before 2020 hand on to someone who they really think can win a general election.
I mean, these plans never work, do they? This is a huge punt on Angela Eagle's part.
I was struck by just how miserable she sounds. I mean, have you ever heard anybody launching a leadership bid and sounding that depressed about it? And I think that is because, exactly as we've been saying, there is no resolution to this. If she wins, it's a Pyrrhic victory. If she loses, the situation isn't resolved. It feels that the only time it will be resolved is at the next general election when voters have to decide what sort of Labour MPs, if they are Labour-leaning, what sort of Labour candidates they want to fight that election. Well, if she wins, the Labour Party conference will be a bloodbath, won't it?
Yes, last year's was already quite lively, and this year's I think might be, in the same way you got the Tory Party conference, you get people screaming at you as you go in. I think there might be quite a lot of that this time.
Well, probably worth the price of admission to both party conferences this autumn. The referendum result came as a shock to many, not least those in the campaign to remain. Lucy Thomas was Deputy Director of Britain Stronger In an exclusive for the Sunday Politics, she talks to fellow campaign insiders about how the referendum was lost.
We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win. It looks as though
it was a shock. Right up until the end, we thought that Remain could win. So how did we end up here?
I'm Lucy Thomas, and I was Deputy Director of that campaign, and one of those that was there from the beginning. This is the story of what we did and why, but why, in the end, it wasn't enough. So let's go back to where it started. We launched Britain Stronger in Europe on a cold October morning last year, in this former brewery. Cue the usual jokes about our organisation.
We set out to persuade people that Britain was stronger, safer and better off in Europe than we would be out on our own, and that leaving was a leap in the dark, a risk we couldn't afford to take. As a nation of Eurosceptics, we always knew it would be tough, but I'm not sure we were prepared for what the early research showed.
When we presented that and sat down and we discussed it with you and the team, I think everybody sort of gulped a bit and thought, God, this is going to be a bit harder than we thought.
Good morning.
So we built a campaign based on numbers. It's the economy, stupid, and it had been proven to work in the Scottish referendum and the general election. But were numbers enough this time?
And I think one of the reasons why some of the specific warnings just sort of bounced off people was it sounded like scaremongering because it wasn't evidence. It was just saying, if we vote to leave, it'll cost us this many jobs or this much growth or you'll be this much worse off. Well, why will I?
And people said they were crying out to hear from the experts. So from business leaders to economists, scientists to defence chiefs, they all spoke for themselves. And the weight of expert opinion was overwhelming.
The consequences would be negative if the UK was to leave the European Union.
Material slowdown in growth, notable increase in inflation. That's the MPC's judgment.
In a sense, we were the victims of our own success in the early parts of the campaign because we landed our economic message like an atomic weapon. We pushed the Leave campaign from Norway to Canada to Albania and then finally pushed them entirely off the single market. Of course, what it meant is that that was the moment when they decided to adopt Nigel Farage's approach to this referendum and to make it all about immigration.
Imagine what will happen to public services when Albania, Macedonia...
When I first saw their PPB, the one with all the arrows implying that millions and millions of people from all sorts of countries, including Turkey and possibly some other countries that aren't in the EU, are going to come and move to Britain. When I showed that to focus groups, it was very powerful. Because it captured the anxiety and fear and emotion people have at the prospect of being overwhelmed and flooded and overrun. And these are all terms that I would hear in focus groups. And I knew that that PPB and the literature that was used off the back of it was very powerful. I also knew, of course, that it was purposefully choosing xenophobia, indeed racism.
So we always knew that immigration was a problem. And it was in this room, around this table, that lots of the discussions were had. Some wondered, was there more we could do to get EU leaders to say something, to show more flexibility on free movement maybe? But to others, that meant fighting the rest of the campaign on immigration when we needed for it to be back on the economy.
If you could solve the problem of free movement, it would have been right to move on to immigration. If you can't solve the problem of free movement, moving on to immigration might just make things worse, not better. Of course, it's counterfactual. We don't know. But given what we did know, it made sense to stick to the economy.
But it became clear that for some people, that economic risk didn't mean anything.
I spoke to one man in my constituency who was out one day and he gave me his view of this. He was voting to leave because of all those concerns about immigration in his eyes. And when I said to him, I understand your concerns about that. What do you think about the argument that leaving would be bad for our economy? And he said, what do I care about the economy? I'm a single man with a dog.
There are lots of people in Britain who do feel passed over, forgotten, left behind. They don't see what the future could possibly hold for them or their children, and they're very angry. And this referendum was a chance to attach that anger to the EU. And we realised that really very early on.
Shouldn't Labour have been able to reach out to those voters?
The brutal truth of the matter is the leader of the Labour Party did not campaign with authenticity, passion, conviction or clarity from day one. He simply didn't.
He said he was for Remain, but it was on quite a narrow basis, and I think there was a lot missing in terms of what the broader argument could be. And you know, polling took place during the campaign that showed half our voters didn't even know that our official position was for Remain. So I think more could have been done, yes.
And whether it was true or not, the Leave campaign was determined to use just one number.
The power of their 350 million a week can't be overstated. I mean, in the focus groups, it's quite unusual for floating voters who aren't very interested in politics to have internalised a campaign fact or number, that it comes out spontaneously, and it did. And when in focus group we will say, but have you also noticed there's been a debate about some people saying that isn't actually true? People say, well, vaguely, but it's still a very big number, isn't it?
Good evening.
In the final debate, just days before the vote, the Leave campaign came armed with their catch-all phrase to solve any problem.
Taking back control of our country and our system.
Vote Leave and take back control. We can take back control over our laws. We can take back control over our taxes. We can take back control over our borders, immigration policy and security.
They were being presented with a very simple solution, which was, if you think this is a really serious problem, if you think the pressure of migration is causing these problems with our public services and jobs, we take back control. And what we had, the way I would put it is, we had a complex truth up against a simple lie, and we see what happened.
And what happened will be talked about for decades. Though we'd built the biggest ever cross-party, cross-sector campaign with over 40,000 volunteers, we didn't win the day. This was a campaign where experts were dismissed and conventional wisdom thrown out of the window. Many doubt if campaigns will ever be the same again.
And Matthew Elliott from Vote Leave will be looking at how their campaign won the referendum on the daily politics. Well, Isabel, having looked at that and seen what they are now saying, I've now found myself surprised that Remain lost by only 4 percentage points.
Right, the bottom line is that their big argument on the economy, they went grossly over the top right at the beginning. They tried to create what pollsters call a settled view, which then becomes very difficult to dislodge. But in doing so, they went so far over the top that their claims became unbelievable, and simply adding more experts to it got no response whatsoever from the electorate. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they simply had no answer on the immigration question. And I think that the majority of people who voted Leave, whether or not they would like to admit it, were in their heart of hearts voting so because of immigration. And Remain had no answer on that.
You didn't have to be a rocket scientist or even a psephologist to work out that immigration was going to be the big issue for the Leave people. We knew that. We've spoken on this programme months before the campaign began about that. And yet, even by the end of the campaign, they still had no answer to the immigration issue.
Yeah, and basically that's the legacy of years and years of British politics, where no one will make either a positive case, a straightforwardly positive case for immigration, or a case for the trade-off that you make, a case for you say we accept immigration because of the economic benefits. And I think their economic argument failed because people didn't feel that all these years of prosperity in the City of London had any translation to the real economy. So when you said, well, it would be terrible for the City of London, people thought, what's that got to do with me?
Yes, whatever.
Yeah.
To quote Mr. Blair in a different context. Was there anything Remain could have done to have won?
I think a different renegotiation in January, February by the Prime Minister, which secured some tangible concession on free movement, would have won it for them, actually. I agree with Isabel that the decisive margin were voters who were reasonable people but wanted some sense of control over immigration, didn't feel they were getting it, and therefore, in many ways, as interesting as that video was, it wasn't the internal dynamics of a campaign that was at fault. The reason they didn't have an answer is that Cameron didn't come back from Brussels and Berlin with something solid on free movement.
It was Angela Merkel what lost it?
Well, yes, and I'm sure that she's now bitterly regretting not giving Cameron something. But I think the other thing is that I know that when the Stronger In campaign had their very early meetings, before the campaign officially began, they had a discussion, can we identify 5 positive things about being in the EU that we can sell to voters? And they couldn't come up with any. And that was, again, part of the problem, that they did totally fail to put a positive case. It was just the Project Fear.
But I think it was also David Cameron what lost it, because for years to get elected in the Tory party, to get selected, you had to say you were Eurosceptic.
Yes.
He then had a career where he kept saying, actually, it won't be a big problem if we leave, to then pivot and say, actually, the sky will fall in.
It kind of, a lot of voters concluded, isn't that just typical of the political elite?
You're just making it up as you go along.
Exactly. Well, it's coming up to 11:40. You're watching the Sunday Politics. We say goodbye to viewers in Scotland who leave us now for Sunday Politics Scotland. Coming up here in 20 minutes, the week ahead. First, though, the Sunday Politics where you are.
Hello and welcome to the London section of the show. I'm Sean Lay. Coming up later, a report suggests poverty in outer London is rising. The capital has 1/4 of the nation's wealth. Why have its suburbs been overlooked? With me throughout the programme, Dawn Butler, the Labour MP for Brent Central, and Paul Scully, the Conservative MP for Sutton and Cheam. Welcome to you both. Dawn, first of all, we now know there is going to be another Labour leadership contest. Angela Eagle's thrown her hat in the wind. Are you going to nominate Jeremy Corbyn again this time?
I think that what I want to do tomorrow is have a discussion with everybody to see where we're at and what's happening. I'm really disappointed in how all this has come about. I don't think there should have ever been a vote of no confidence. I think if this is what Angela wanted to do, then she should have done this straight away. You know, we have a procedure, we have a policy within the Labour Party, and she should have just said, OK, I want to challenge Jeremy. What's important to me is where our Labour Party is going, what our policies are and the direction of travel.
The criticism is it's going nowhere under the current leadership.
Well, I think that is wrong, because I have no problems with the stance that Jeremy has taken in his policies. I think we've had lots of wins in the Labour Party against the Tory government.
OK, so you will nominate him again?
I don't know what
I mean, you're not very impressed by Angela Eagle's actions, you said.
No, I'm not impressed by Angela Eagle's action. And actually, I don't know if I want to nominate anyone, because I'm really still quite annoyed that we find ourselves in this position when we shouldn't have been, and we should have just been united.
Although you heard her talking
party.
to Angela a little earlier, you may not have heard this, she said there's a reason for it. She said you can't leave behind an office door, and that's why she thinks there's a problem, and that's what she thinks Jeremy Corbyn is doing.
Yeah, but then we have that. Then when we have a mature debate, where, you know, we're elected politicians, we have a mature debate. For me and for the people who really need a Labour Party and actually really need a Labour government, is what are we doing? Where are we going? What's our policy direction? We're not a personality-led organisation. We should be a policy-led organisation, and that's what's important.
Well, that's the debate that Paul Scully, your party, is having at the moment. You backed Leave in the EU referendum, but you're backing a woman who supported Remain, Theresa May. I don't know if you heard him this morning, but Aaron Banks, the UKIP donor, said, you know, she is not going to deliver what you wanted. He believes, as a fellow outer, that Theresa May will simply come up with some kind of fudge that will disappoint the Leave campaigners.
Well, I went into the second ballot actually trying to give... I originally thought I was going to give the members who have the final say the best selection of two. I think Theresa was nailed on as one of those finalists. But in the end, when I looked at the three candidates, I just couldn't look beyond Theresa's experience, the need for stability, the need to actually continue to govern the country.
Are you not worried that she will do that, though?
No,
So
because
she will
actually,
be the fudge candidate
well, one of
on
the
Europe.
first things I did when I heard Theresa's launch speech that Chris Grayling was leading her campaign, I went to Chris. He's my neighbouring MP. He's a fellow Leaver, and I wanted to get some reassurance. Why had he made that decision? And he reassured me. And since then, I've seen that David Davis is backing her, Priti Patel is backing her, Liam Fox is backing her as
All
well.
people who voted out.
There are significant
Yeah.
senior Leavers that are there that are going to, make sure that Brexit means Brexit.
This is an unprecedented situation. Not only will the next leader of the Labour Party be once again ultimately determined by the members, depending, of course, whether Jeremy Corbyn gets on the ballot paper, whether he gets that chance again. But on the Conservative side, 150,000 people will determine not just the leader of the Conservative Party, but our next Prime Minister. Most of them will never have even been in a room with Theresa May and Andrea Leadsom. That's a rather perverse situation, isn't it?
No, I think this is the... we've had this one-man, one-vote system for a number of years. You're absolutely right that for the first time in 20 years or so, we're not just picking a party leader who we hope will be able to be Prime Minister. We're picking someone who is going to be Prime Minister, who's going to be stepping in into number 10, which is a big responsibility. And that's why, as I say, when I made my choice in the ballot, I couldn't go beyond Theresa, who's been there around the cabinet table, who I think will be able to drive firm negotiations in terms of Brexit. But you know what? It's not all about Brexit, although that's the thing we're all talking about. We've still got a government to run in terms of schools, in terms of hospitals, policing and all these other areas.
And we're going to stay with the subject of Brexit, because the political fallout from that referendum is continuing. Mayor Khan this week warned that Brexit is going to put the battle against air pollution in the capital at risk, with potentially life-threatening implications for Londoners. So what should we be doing to prevent it? Raphael Sheridan has more.
It's claimed the capital's dirty air causes around 9,500 premature deaths every year. This week, the Mayor Sadiq Khan unveiled his plans to tackle the problem. It includes extending the size of the ultra-low emission zone to everything within the North and South circulars and bringing its introduction forward to 2019. Drivers of the most polluting vehicles will have to pay up to £100 to drive in it, depending on the size of the engine. And in the interim, from next year there'll also be a new additional £10 charge on the most polluting vehicles that are over 10 years old driving into central London. He called on the government to be bold.
The national government needs to be brave as well. There needs to be a new National Clean Air Act. There needs to be a diesel scrappage scheme. The government needs to ensure that London is around the table when it comes to deal with Brussels.
According to the Mayor, our decision to leave the European Union may also have an impact. Our air quality was governed by EU law, and in the future this may not apply. And according to Klein Earth, the government will not apply the same rigorous standards after Brexit.
The government hates the EU Ambient Air Quality Directive. They've been fighting tooth and nail against Klein Earth in the courts for the last 5 years. They've been lobbying in Brussels to try and weaken it. So you can bet the first opportunity they get to scrap it, they will take it. So I think that's why we're calling for a Clean Air Act. 60 years after the Clean Air Act 1956, we need a new Clean Air Act which really enshrines these rights that we had benefit from EU law into our domestic legislation.
It remains to be seen what impact the decision to leave the European Union will have, but it is clear that this is an issue of life and death.
Paul Scully, do you think it's time for a National Clean Air Act again?
I think there's something we've absolutely got to work together on. I know, looking at Zach Goldsmith's manifesto, Sadiq Khan's manifesto in terms of clean air, there were actually a lot of similarities, which we're now seeing in terms of the consultation that Sadiq has put out there.
But if national government is kicking against what the EU has set as the limits, and indeed the Supreme Court ruling last year said that UK limits in many areas exceeded what the EU had said, and we leave the EU, as we're going to do, isn't there a danger that pressure will disappear and that national government will lose interest?
No, I don't think there is, because I think, well, first of all, in terms of those areas that you were saying were quite high, there's one in my neighbouring constituency in the borough of Wallington. It's got one of the highest, I think it's the 17th highest street in terms of pollutants in London. So it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we hold the government their feet to the fire, the democratically elected government, and all we're talking about
and you'd like
Brexit
them to maintain
is bringing
those
control back
standards,
here.
would you?
Absolutely,
Right.
because London is somewhere where Londoners in particular will suffer as a result of high pollution.
But the government have not taken it seriously enough. I mean, they were supposed to meet certain targets by this year, 2016. They had said to the courts they're not going to meet those targets until 2030. When they were taken to court, they then reduced that to 2025. And in my constituency in Brent, we are 85% over the EU limits in some areas. And it is a matter of life and death, with 10,000 people, almost 10,000 people dying every year because of poor air quality.
Is it then, Dawn Butler, enough for the Mayor to simply say, I'm going to accelerate the ultra-low emission zone by a year? I mean, that's an inadequate response, isn't it, if the scale of the problem is that threatening? He promised to keep Londoners safe. As you say, nearly 10,000 of us are dying prematurely every year because the air we're breathing is not safe.
Well, if it was just that in isolation, then it would be inadequate response. But seeing as it's just one of many measures, I don't think it's an inadequate response. So everything in regards to the diesel scrappage scheme, for instance, which was never...
Unfortunately, that'll be a national thing. He doesn't have the power to do that.
Right, but he's fighting to get an agreement, and he said he will accelerate. The Mayor has said he will accelerate the diesel scrappage scheme, and he has got a commitment from the government able to do that. And also, in regards to buses and making sure, sort of retrospectively fitting them to make sure that they are less pollutant to the air.
Because unfortunately, all our buses at the moment are diesel, and diesel is the big problem here, we're
even
told.
the new buses.
And even the new buses, ironically.
Yeah.
But Paul Scully, there's an economic problem here, isn't there? I mean, there was some statistic that City Hall put out last autumn. I think 98% of the kilometres that are driven by vans in London are driven by diesel vans. So all those working people who come into London, whether they're delivery workers or doing service work in central London, coming from your borough, maybe coming from Brent as well, they're contributing to this. If you penalise those people, it has an economic impact.
Well, this is why the consultation is going to be really important, to actually exactly understand how that's going to affect business. because what happened over a number of years, people were actually encouraged, don't forget that, not that long ago, to actually buy diesel because it was seen as the more environmentally
cleaner alternative. Yeah.
And then, so if you just look at black cabs, for example, how they have to go through a number of hoops and then keep having to invest 30, 40, 50,000 pounds in order to keep up with the latest legislation. We do have to bear that in mind. On the other hand, you can't compromise on air quality because, as Dawn said, it does affect people's lives.
OK. We'll come back in a moment, but it was striking that in the Europe referendum, we talked a bit about inner and outer London, whilst inner London voted Remain, 5 of the outer boroughs wanted out. Could that have anything to do with the problems identified in the suburbs by a new report? The Smith Institute, a Labour-leaning think tank, suggests poverty is now greater in outer London than it is in the centre. Job creation is weaker and crime is also slightly higher, even as the economy of London as a whole continues to grow. Andrew Crine reports.
West Croydon, bustling, ethnically diverse, a bit rough around the edges. This is Zone 5, but maybe looks and feels more like the inner city.
Now, back in the 1980s, when I was at school, my geography teacher explained how London worked like this. So there was a centre of the city, which was where the West End and Buckingham Palace, all of that sort of stuff was. Then there was the inner city, which was run down, post-industrial, had high crime rates and all the rest of it. But outside of that, there was the suburbs, leafy, green, where people lived. But according to a new report out this week, all of that is now out of date.
According to the Smith Institute think tank, there are now 1.2 million people in outer London who live in poverty according to the government's preferred measure. That's compared to just 1 million in inner London. In the Central shopping centre in Croydon, the charity Lives Not Knives, which helps young people and tries to tackle problems around violence.
I've visited a classroom before where a young boy said he's seen his dad be shot in the head in front of him. So, and that's just one story. There are multiple stories. It's a huge change from when I was young anyway. And now I know of people that actually are finding it quite hard living in the north of the borough, and they're finding it, they feel quite threatened.
According to that Smith Institute report again, economic growth in London has been incredibly uneven, with 500,000 jobs created in inner London in the last decade we have figures for, compared to just 8,000 in outer London. There is economic growth in Croydon, but according to local MP Gavin Barwell, not enough.
In many ways, outer London now has equal problems to inner London. I think the whole distinction is now a false one. There's still some real pockets of deprivation in inner London, but there also is in outer London as well, and we don't see the same level of public investment going into our outer London boroughs. So I think there are a number of urgent things that we need to look at to address what this report has found.
Fortunes, of course, do change. This is Bermondsey in the 1980s. And this is Bermondsey Street today, the type of place where, if you're so inclined, it's very easy to spend £4.50 on a loaf of sourdough bread.
Now, in the last 15 years, the bit of Bermondsey where I'm standing has been completely transformed, as some would have it, gentrified. Now, of course, the same is true of lots of the parts of London which, not that long ago, were deemed the most frightening and dangerous places to be. So, for example, King's Cross, Brixton, Hackney, Peckham and so on.
They're also some of the parts of the UK with the strongest vote to remain in the European Union. According to the Smith Institute's Paul Hunter, the author of the report, there is a link.
Places in inner London have seen growth and renaissance, whereas in places in the outer London have perhaps not had such a good time over the last 10 or 20 years. So it's that comparison with how it was and how it now is.
The only London boroughs to have voted to leave the EU were all on the outskirts of the city, suggesting that at least to some extent, people in the suburbs have been less content with the direction the city's been travelling in.
Well, we'll speak again to Paul and Dawn in a moment, but first, Sean Bailey is a London Assembly member. He was also Youth and Crime Advisor to David Cameron. Sean, welcome to the Sunday Politics. You've just moved from inner London to outer London. You've also read this report. Does it chime with your experience?
100%. I was in inner London. I was in Zone 2 for years, born and bred. I'm now in Zone 6, and I see higher levels of deprivation and, more importantly, less help. The help is not there. I think the inner London boroughs have a better story to tell about poverty, and that's affected who gets the money. Inner London boroughs regularly get better levels of funding from the government and more one-off funding. Out in outer boroughs, I think, there's a real feeling we've been left to ourselves, definitely.
I should say you're a bit out of breath because you've had a bit of a journey in from Zone 6 this morning, and we're grateful for you persisting with that. But when you look at, for example, some of the figures that are in their report, over 10 years, job creation in inner London, 500,000 new jobs created. In outer London, in the same period, 8,000. Do you get a sense that it is because of a lack of economic growth and activity, or is it something different about the culture of outer London?
I think it's a lack of economic growth, and also as well, you have to look at the makeup of London, where it's becoming important. The outer boroughs are now absorbing a lot of the housing need, and that means shifting communities. So we are getting people who need more support to be employed, and we're not receiving that same support. Also as well, if you look at policy, so the mayor has this ULEZ, which is ultra low emissions. That's been spread. It's the proposal to spread it all across London, but that will punish the outer boroughs. We don't have the same poor air quality, but we will be paying the premium, and that forces business not to take people on it, pay for the ULEZ or pay for staff. So the choices there mean that we don't employ people.
So what would be your answer to this? I mean, the report talks about creating a suburban task force, but I mean, that's just a mechanism to deliver changes. What would be the changes, do you think?
The suburban task force already exists. It's called local councils.
Yep.
The bottom line is we need to change the settlement that councils get from government. There needs to be slightly better weighting to favour the outer boroughs.
This is what Gavin Barber was talking about.
Exactly, because that's where the real energy is to get something done and where the real pain is felt. Also as well, I think the mayor can not be an inner London mayor. There's an argument that all four of the mayors so far have been inner London mayors because that's where you all are, the media, that's where the excitement is. But actually the work is to be done in the outer boroughs, particularly as we are about to absorb a lot of the housing need.
Let me bring in Paul and Dawn at this point. I mean, let's be honest about this. London has been hugely successful in economic terms. The rest of the country will not tolerate more resources being diverted from them into London. So London has to do it itself. Would you buy the argument, the one that Gavin Barwell is making and Sean is echoing, that there needs to be some kind of a rebalancing of the resources in London between the inner London boroughs and outer London?
Yeah.
So, go on, Paul.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely, because I think, as Gavin said, the division between inner London and outer London is starting to cloud. You know, Sutton does not look like the same as it did 20 years ago. That's not a bad thing, and but it's just a very different place to when I moved there 28 odd years ago. And also, I think to just treat outer London as a ring, as a donut, is a mistake, because Sutton is not the same as Brent, is not the same as Havering, is not the same as Barnet, and those. So you do need to look at each outer London borough separately and find those.
But this could cost your constituency, Brent, couldn't it? If that kind of thing happened, where, for example, the extra money that inner London boroughs get to contribute to pay for teachers, for example, were to be reduced. I mean, your council tax is lower than inner London than it is in outer London on average. I mean, those kinds of things will hurt people.
Well, no, I think what we need to look at is opportunities and mobilities around London, so inner and outer London. Once we look at those and make sure it's fair and equitable, then everybody will benefit. It's not about making the pie smaller, it's about making it bigger so that everybody benefits from it. And I think we'd see that...
What about just sharing around the existing pie more fairly?
And sharing it around, I agree. I mean, the government has made such savage cuts to local authorities, especially those in outer London and inner London. Brent is actually outer London. It's the government that are making these savage cuts. So the blame has to fall on this Conservative government's
I would
door.
disagree.
And can
the
I
whole,
say,
the whole,
can I finish?
The whole country's having to absorb those cuts. It isn't just
No. That's where you're wrong. The percentage, the government say, right, I'm going to make a 10% cut. A 10% cut in outer London authorities has a greater effect than a 10% cut on authorities that don't use as much money. So in percentage terms, it might be the same, but actually that's smoke and mirrors. So the effectiveness of how much money is essentially
it effectively
lost.
comes down to...
No.
There's no argument. There's no
more.
argument here if the government's making cuts. That's a fact. There's no argument here. When the time where those cuts have been accepted, they're happening. The bottom line is that inner London boroughs get more money. That's it. It's not particularly technical. You need to share some money to the outer boroughs so that we can support London as a whole.
Well, at least we've got some consensus on that.
Yeah.
Sean,
Always.
thanks very much for coming in. And out of breath, you staggered through, and we're very grateful to you. We'll be back in just a moment after we look at the rest of the news as it affects us in London in 60 seconds.
London Mayor Sadiq Khan has said he is concerned that a new generation of Londoners are hearing racially offensive terms for the first time. Following the EU referendum result, the number of hate crimes reported to the Met Police increased from between 25 to 50 a day to a peak of 88. The RMT Rail Union has offered to suspend industrial action over Southern Rail plans to introduce more driver-only trains, with conductors no longer operating doors. The union said it would not call further action for 3 months if Southern Rail also suspended its proposals for a similar period. A patient lay dead for up to 4.5 hours undetected at one of the busiest A&E departments in the country, inspectors have revealed. A review of North Middlesex University Hospital also found there were too few competent doctors who were able to assess and treat patients at night.
Dawn, is this rise in hate crime that we've seen, do you think, just a spasm? Will it fade again?
Obviously, I hope it does fade, but I think it needs to be tackled. I think we need to tackle... A lot of it was underlying, so there was a lot of underlying kind of discrimination and racial hatred and also misunderstanding of issues. And I think we have to tackle that so that it's not just papered over easily.
Paul, the RMT Southern Railway dispute continues at the moment. Which side, if either of them, do you think can claim the moral high ground in this?
Well, frankly, I don't think either. I think that RMT, I welcome the fact that they say they're not going to, they would call off further action. I want them to go further, though. I want them to speak to the people that are taking extra sick days off. There are extraordinary amount of sickness, and it's effectively unofficial action. And until we can get rid of that, we can't solve the problem about the driver-operated only trains. And that, at the moment, is exacerbating. It's failing us being able to tackle the underlying poor performance of Southern. We need to get rid of this union issue and then start to tackle Southern for the poor performance.
And is poor performance the argument that Labour uses to say we should renationalise the railway?
No, I just think, frankly, we need to get to the point when we can have a different franchise holder, but we can't strip them at them.
It can be run for not-for-profit. It could be brought in and sort of renationalised and run as a not-for-profit and be more efficient and effective than it currently is.
What I think we've agreed on, that Transport for London are actually going to look after the franchise in a few years' time.
Paul Scully, Dawn Butler, thank you both very much. And it's back to Andrew.
So, will Angela Eagle succeed in replacing Jeremy Corbyn? Could Angela Leadsom take the Tory crown? And are senior Tories really discussing plans for a new centre ground party with the Lib Dems? All questions for the week ahead. And joining us, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron. Welcome back on the programme.
Morning, Andrew.
Will the Liberal Democrats campaign to rejoin the EU come the next general election?
Well, we have to see what the lay of the land will be come the general election. Could be October, could be May 2020. And if it's either of those things, that obviously makes a difference. But just like every other Liberal leader since 1955, I believe, I will have in my manifesto a commitment that Britain is better off at the heart of Europe. There's a long way...
A member of the EU... I mean, suppose... Chris Grayling said to us this morning he thinks we'll be out by the next election. If it's 2020, look, if it's in October this year, all bets are off.
Indeed.
You'll have to take your position then. But if the Parliament goes its term and we're out of the EU, we're into the 2020 election, would you like your party to have a commitment to rejoin?
Well, I wanted to be part of Europe, and I would like us, as things are, to be part of the European Union. Of course, if you'd asked me 12 months ago, I would not have predicted that we'd have left the EU. I wouldn't have predicted that Jeremy Corbyn would lead the Labour Party, or that David Cameron would have just resigned. So it's hard to predict in
You're not answering my question, though, are
well,
you?
because in 4 years' time, the lie of the land could be very different.
Yeah, but I'm saying if we're out, would you... I'm just trying to work out, if you feel so strongly about it, will you accept the referendum result, or will you try to get us back into the EU? That's what I'm trying to get at.
I accept the referendum result. I think at the moment the trajectory is towards Brexit, and we have to accept that. I will have no time for MPs, and some do, who say that we should be undoing the result. That does not mean that I give up my campaign for Britain to be in the EU. I mean, as it's been said by others, you know, you have an election, and if you lose, you accept that with good grace, but you don't give up your principles and keep believing what you do. And so I hope that Britain will remain in the EU. I hope it will be the choice of the electors that that's the case. Politicians mustn't force that upon the majority.
You say you hope Britain will remain in the EU, but I may have missed this. Didn't we just vote to come out?
So the 52% were very clear what they voted against, and that was all they were asked to do. They were not asked to vote for one of the 5 or 6 different potential exit strategies or directions, whether it be full access to the single market, some level of free movement, or whether it's the almost North Korea option that a handful of people would prefer the United Kingdom to have. It seems to me right that the British people, before we leave the EU, are given the choice as to whether they want whatever it is our new Prime Minister comes back
So you want a referendum on the terms of departure now?
Well, let's be honest, nobody's voted for what comes next. People have voted to leave the EU, you must accept that. But it seems right to me that the British people, having made the choice 2 weeks ago, should also be allowed to choose what it is we get as the next step.
Well, that sounds like a referendum on the terms to me, otherwise it's meaningless, is it not?
Which I'm not massively in favour of, because I think what we've seen is that people are busy and they find it difficult to find the time for political campaigns. We have representative democracy for a reason, and there are some decisions I think that are better thrashed out and compromised between people who've been elected by voters to do that for them, rather than putting every single thing to a referendum. But I do think Tim's got a point to say that there is no problem with people campaigning for another referendum.
No.
1975 we had a referendum. It's not like all the anti-Europeans then went, well, it turns out everyone really likes the EU. They campaigned continuously for the next 30 years.
Took him 40 years, though, didn't it? So it's 40 years before he gets another referendum.
But it's not entirely
Even
impossible,
he might not. He's a young lad. Who's to
say?
Who's to say? You may, indeed.
Yep.
I mean, Gladstone was there forever.
I'll be about Gladstone's age by the time that comes along. My sense is that, I mean, I agree with you in one sense that we don't want to be going to the public with a referendum on every single issue. The problem is that this government, in a chaotic way, has established that principle, which means that, frankly, it would be utterly wrong and anti-democratic for the MPs to then overturn in any way, shape or form what the electorate have just done. So that means that in terms of endorsing what happens next, and the 52% perhaps have 52 different ideas of what it was that exit looks like, and that's fine, they're entitled to that, but I think Britain needs to choose what happens next. It also needs,
hold on, let me bring
Article 50 is invoked, to choose whether they would prefer status quo.
So it is another referendum, all right. So it's very European. Keep having referendums to get the result you want. You're signed.
Well, I think that there is a real danger that MPs will, over a course of time, basically dilute Brexit and not deliver it properly. And I thought that it was very interesting that people like Chris Grayling are actually arguing that Brexit is safer in the hands of Theresa May. Now, why is he arguing that when she was a Remainer? Because he says that she has the backing of the majority of Tory MPs. And of course, in Parliament, most MPs, a majority of MPs are for Remain. And he says that only Theresa May can actually push through Brexit, which is very counterintuitive, but makes sense when you think about it.
Surely no government could agree to a referendum on the terms, because Europe would then say, oh, so you need another vote. You're getting nothing then.
Yeah, it would be like Congress being given a referendum or announcing a referendum on a trade deal that they negotiate with another country. Why would the other country do a deal if it's subject to your own domestic politics? So I think a second referendum is unlikely. I do fear, however, that the entirety of this Parliament will be taken up by the process of extrication.
Could I just, what did you just say there about Article 50?
So look, if it is the case, and if the legal interpretation is that once one's invoked Article 50, then the matter is out of our hands, that's a little bit like jumping out of a plane without being sure whether you have a parachute. And so it seems to me the British people should be allowed to check the integrity and the safety of the parachute before we do just that. It means, do we know what we're going into? If we decide, if it is the collective will of the people, and it may not be, that we should be in the single market, for example, as many Brexiteers believe, then for us to press the button to leave the European Union without any guarantee that we'd have that access would seem to be foolish and against the national interest.
So are you saying that we need a referendum before we press Article 50?
Well, we'll have to see what the legal advice is, but I would not want us to be in a position where there was no turning back before we knew what we were getting ourselves into.
But the legal issue isn't about a referendum. The legal issue is whether you need to get a vote in Parliament to trigger Article 50.
To my mind, that is detail. What really I'm bothered about is whether or not the United Kingdom puts itself in a position where there's no turning back and it has to settle for whatever bad deal we might get out of the other 27.
But once it triggers Article 50, that's it. There's a 2-year timetable to do the deal.
And then you're out.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if you've done that, my understanding is that then there isn't an opportunity for us to effectively negotiate. We get what we're given, and it might be a really bad deal. And my job is now to make sure Britain gets a really good deal. The problem is that the discussions now might well all be about Brexit the next 2, 3, 4 years even. It's going to move on from being the stuff for the political classes as people experience the fact that, you know, they have less money to spend on holiday, the fact their savings are worth less, the fact their jobs are at risk.
Let's not refight the referendum
now. But it becomes bread and butter and people begin to realise the reality of it.
Let me ask you this, because there's some indication of in the Sunday Times this morning. Do you want to rebrand your party? Do you think that the term Liberal Democrats is tarnished? Do you want to change the name to the Democrats?
I don't. My sense is that, you know, our party has nearly doubled in size since the last election 13 months ago. It's gone up by another 16,000 in the last fortnight. There's clearly a real movement of people, particularly younger people, joining the Liberal Democrats. You see the chaos in the other two parties, the need for a
So you're quite happy
strong...
with the Lib Dem
I am,
brand?
but let me put...
What about Labour Democrats? Does that sound good?
My sense is that if you look at the other parties and you look at where the Liberal Democrats are, we're in a position where we are now the marketplace, where progressives and moderates from other parties can safely gather. And so I want to say that we are absolutely open to talking to others in other parties. One of the good things I got out of the referendum, not the result, but everything else, was the fact that I shared, and many of us shared, platforms with people who we discovered we agree with a lot more than just on the European Union, and that would be good to take forward.
Have you got any Tories in your crosshairs?
I talk to lots of people. I'm not going to kiss
you
and tell.
always say that. Answer the question.
Well, that wouldn't be very fair, would it?
I'm not asking for names. I'm just saying, have you got some?
I talk to lots of people. Politics is really
to me, but I'm not
politics is really fluid, to say the least. You've noticed.
Do you buy this realignment? I mean, the Lib Dems, they would, for it to happen at all, they would need both Andrea Leadsom to be the Tory leader and Jeremy Corbyn to stay as the Labour leader.
It requires a lot to happen. If it were to happen, if Leadsom did become Tory leader, Jeremy Corbyn was strengthened as Labour leader, then you've got actually not just a centrist party potentially, but a very big centrist party. What I would issue as a warning is that that new party would still be subject to all the squabbles that any existing party suffers. So, for example, were I to join and Tim were to join, there'd be a debate about what centrism means. Is it social democracy, or is it something more economically liberal? Does it mean complete commitment to the European Union, or does it mean honouring the referendum and getting out? It would be no less prone to the internal disagreements that you have in Labour and the Tories.
Did you buy this story this morning? There were 20 Tory MPs threatening to leave if Andrea Leadsom should become leader. Or that was just to frighten the horses, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't buy that at all. That sounded like 20 hissy fits to me. What I would say, though, in relation to a realignment is I think it's interesting what's going to happen to the UK Independence Party. Tim said that the Lib Dems were where the marketplace is, but think about all those people that voted for a variety of different reasons for Brexit and what happens to UKIP. I think we'll see that rebranding under a different name as some kind of People's Party, and that could be picking up a lot of Lib Dem and Labour votes.
Is Tim Farron right to be content, not content, but confident with the position the Lib Dems are in at the moment?
I think I was going to say last man standing, possibly token male leader
Yes, indeed.
after all
Yep.
this. So,
Yep.
I
Happy
think
to help.
The joy for the Lib Dems is they have a very clear position and they're not gunning to be a majority party. As Janan says, they can have a focus and a unity that other parties don't have.
We shall see. Tim Farron, thanks for being with us. I'm
Thank
afraid
you.
we've run out of time. The Daily Politics is back at midday on BBC Two all this week. I'll be back here next Sunday on BBC One at 11 o'clock. Remember, if it's Sunday, it is the Sunday Politics.